Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this little session from me, Aslak Knudsen, and Andrew Rubinger, both from Red Hat. We're going to take you on an interesting tour around the Arquillian universe and show you what's going on in the sphere of testing. So when you hear the word testing, what's the first thing that kind of comes to mind? Anyone have any good? No one? Sorry? JUnit, right. Well, more of the feeling of what you feel when you hear testing. That most people is, it's no fun, it's boring, it's too slow, too hard. And as developers, we all know that our code is not full of bugs anyway, right? So there's no point of testing. But there's a different aspect to testing. It's not necessarily to verify the correctness of your code, but it's to verify that when you change the code, it's actually still doing what it was supposed to do. That's more of the agile approach to testing. So we like to talk about something called the testing gap. And that's when we're moving from the unit tests, which are normally defined as very simple single class or method type testing. It's easy to mock out, it's easy to work with. Then when we're moving over to integration, and especially when we're talking Java, we're normally ending up in some form of container, that being a bean container or a application server EE type container. And then your test has to deal with setting up that container, doing the deployment, starting and stopping it. And if you're developing for more than one platform, that being, for instance, JBoss or JBoss and Tomcat or Glassfish, then your test suite starts to get bound to how these different servers are started differently and controlled differently. So that makes it a lot harder to do the integration testing, and most people end up kind of skipping it and going over to a more of the old type of manual QA department who sits and reads through hundreds of test scripts on how this is supposed to work. And same with functional as well. Well, the scale just keeps going upwards. So in the Arquillian project, or the Arquillian framework, or the universe as we like to call it, we have three core principles. The first one is that a test should be portable between different runtime environments. The second is it should be executed from both the IDE and the build tools that you're using. You're not going to have to go out of your development mode and go to some third-party system and start hacking around with massive build systems to build your whole application and get you out of the tiny scope of what you were actually trying to test or where you were in the code at that point. And the third principle is we're not going to reinvent the wheel here. We're going to reuse the different testing frameworks that are out there. There's a lot of frameworks for doing persistence, for doing transactional testing that works perfectly fine, but they're still missing the crucial part of handling the containers. So to start at the bottom of the universe, or the top, whichever way you want to look at it, we have Arquillian Core. And Arquillian Core in itself is just a tiny little event machine that doesn't really do anything on its own. But Core as we know it, it's built to be flexible in the sense that what technology we have today is not going to be what's going to be there tomorrow, even though it will be there for a while. We don't want to redevelop this framework constantly. So it's flexible in the sense that it can handle most anything within the platforms that we're targeting. And by that, or we deal with flexibility by being extensible. It means that anyone can write a extension to handle new functionality or new technology that is needed within the testing space. So Arquillian Core itself has three types of extensions. It's one for testing, one for container, and one to integrate the two. So the testing extension is a set of SPIs to integrate against some known test runner, being JUnit, TestNG, or Spock, or JBehave, and the likes. Someone that will control the interaction and start up Arquillian itself. On the other side of the scale, it's the container extension. And that's the SPIs for interacting with the different containers. Ranging from, or container can be defined as anything that is providing you a runtime that provides you services. So it's not necessarily an application server. It could be Google App Engine. It could be a cloud. It could be a physical server. It could be a mail server, for that matter. We normally try to categorize container types in 3 different styles. It's an embedded type of container that runs within the same JVM as your test runner. Then it's the remote one which runs somewhere else. It could still be on the same physical machine, but it is in a different JVM. But it might as well be on a cloud somewhere, or your testing environment in your office, or staging, or production. And then we have the managed, which kind of combines the two. And it's a different JVM, but it's something that Arquillian can control as well, so it can start and stop it. And that's typically a container that runs on your local machine, but runs in a different JVM. Just move over to how would you set up something like this. Well, it's not a requirement from Arquillian's side to use a dependency management system, but it will help you a lot. So while you can use Ant, for instance, on its own and get all the different jars and modules set up on the class path, Maven and Gradle and Ant plus Ivy, using their dependency mechanisms, makes that task a lot easier. Basically allowing you to pull in all the container client dependencies, pulling in the component APIs. So in the Maven example, what we do is set up the Arquillian BOM, which is the overall bill of material, as we call it, that handles how to or the different versions of the different components that are available, to simplify it for you, so you don't have to necessarily know all the different versions of the subcomponents that are in there. The next step is then to add on to the testing framework integration that you want, that being, in this case, JUnit or TestNG. And from there on, you have the base Arquillian setup, and you can start to write your test. So if we look at how the basic test class, what it looks like. This is basically what you can say to be a JUnit skeleton. It has a class, it has a test method, and it does some assertions. So when we add on the Arquillian bits to it, it uses the JUnit, or in the JUnit integration, it uses JUnit's run with annotation so JUnit will hand over the control of running and executing this test case to Arquillian. And then there's this deployment method, which defines the isolation level of this specific test. Which environment should this be running in? And then by reusing the component models that are under test, in this case it's using the JSR 330 or CDI to inject back the running instance that is deployed on the server. Okay. So the deployment method that you saw there, that's using an API called ShrinkWrap. And ShrinkWrap is a Java API for doing packaging. So you can create your Java archive, your web archives, or enterprise archives. It will operate on the client test class path, so in the same class path as your test. So you can add classes, add packages, add file resources, class loader resources, and so on, and package them up the way you like, in simply very narrow point to what you really want to test, and not necessarily the whole application as you would through some other type of build system. And along with ShrinkWrap, there's a project called ShrinkWrap Resolvers. And that helps you out with the integration against the dependency management systems. So you can load up the Palm file that you're using. You can get the dependencies that is already defined there. It will go out to the repository system either locally on your disk or remote and fetch the different dependencies together. And the next one is the descriptors, which basically does the same for your configuration files as it does for the archiving, where you can create your web app descriptors, your EGB descriptors, application descriptors, etc. When you look at this test, there's nothing that binds this to a specific container. So how is that done? Arquillian uses the class path and what's available on there, typically the standard Java SPI type pattern. So when you add in a specific container adapter, it will then find that and use that as the target environment. Normally split up in like this case where you have multiple profiles that are being run in Maven, so you can select between if you want to run against JRebel say 7 or Glassfish and so on. So how does this work in the inner core? So the first step when you run your, let's take the example of the JUnit test. The first step is that JUnit starts up Arquillian. Arquillian will look for the container, and depending on what type of container it is, it will either connect to a running instance or start it. First you have to select the container, and then you can connect or start to it. As I said, that could be anything from a simple bean container like Spring or Weld, or up to a remote cloud somewhere. Arquillian doesn't really matter. No, it doesn't really care. And then it comes into the packaging phase where it will, amongst other things, run the deployment method that was defined there to package up the environment, then include itself and deploy to the container. And then through a remote protocol between the client and the container, it will start to execute the test. And at this point, your test is actually running inside the container itself, so you have access to all the resources that your application normally would. That being injection of beans or transaction managers, EJBs, doing security lookups, or database. Then it transfers those test results back to the back to the client side, and those are then converted back to the test framework's own integration. So they will pop up when you run it through JUnit in the IDE. They will pop up as any normal JUnit test, and same with when you run it through Maven Surefire, for instance. That will also come out as the standard Surefire reports. Then the last step is to undeploy and to clean up the container. So if we look at first the see them that time?
What's that?
Do that?
I'll take care of it each time.
All right. So the first thing we're gonna look at is what does Arquillian core in itself provide, and how can you do your testing based on that?
Figure it out.
So we have a tiny little application here that basically has some JPA entities. It has a stateless session bean to do the interaction with the entity manager. We have a REST service, and we have a view CDI bean to be used with CDI. If you go one down and start up the server first. No, in the other console. And then the other one as well, one over. Mm-hmm. So first thing we're gonna start up a JBoss AS7 server that we have running on our laptop. And then we're going to use that as our target platform when we run the test. If we look at the, I can even see this myself. So if we look at the JPI test, the conference repository test case, well, what you will see, no, the core.
Does that not say conference?
What's the one that was open?
Oh, sorry.
Further down, core.
Sorry, buddy, can't see it.
Conference repository, there we go.
Just point me.
Yeah, that one.
This one? Oh.
Right, so you see in the top of that one, you will see the deployment that we spoke about. In this case, we have kind of abstracted it away from the actual method itself, but it's calling out to a static factory to create our little deployment. And next, we then do the injection of the conference repository, and we inject the normal user transaction. And then in our test case, we can then, by having a little transactional callable, we can call different things within our own transactional scope. So in one case, we want to store a conference within one transaction, and within another transaction, we want to fetch fetch what we have stored, and then see that those different values are equal. So from the IDE, you can just right-click on that and say run as JUnit test. If we swap back to the AS7 server, you will see that the deployment starting to deploy. You will find the EJBs. It will set up the database, start weld, and execute the test cases in there somewhere, and then undeploy them again. And we have a green bar. So that's the aspect of Arquillian from core, where we're doing the test in container. But there's still valid cases where you want to poke at the external entry points, like a REST service or a HTML page, for instance. If we look at the conference REST client test case, one below. What's different in this case is that we have defined the deployment as not being testable. It's a very poorly worded thing, but it means that Arquillian will not do anything specific for this deployment. It will basically just deploy it to the server, and your test case itself is then running on the client side, so you can only reach the remote endpoints. What's interesting here, though, is that Arquillian, since it controls the container, it controls the deployment, it also knows what's in that deployment. So by using the Arquillian resource, we can inject back the URL to the web context that we just deployed. So you don't have to externalize that into properties files going between different server environments, for instance. So if it's your staging server or your cloud server, Arquillian will still just inject a different URL depending on where the target ended up. In this case, we're not doing any more fancy than just calling the HTTP connection and sending some XML objects back and forth to verify that the REST service that is a a post on the conference will store it, and a get on the conference with an ID will actually return that same conference to us. If you again just run that as a JUnit test, and yeah, that's done. Should have a green bar somewhere. Green bar. So that's the two different aspects that Arquillian core gives you. It's the container control, it's the in container or outside of the container, and with the full access to operate on the in container services that the container provides. If you go back to the slides and then start to go into what the did I close it maybe? Go one back on the tabs there, and just scroll your way down to where we're supposed to be.
How do you scroll?
Yeah, next. Sorry about that. So the first extension we're going to look at is the persistent extension. I'll go back a couple. There we go. So when we saw the JPA test that was in the core, it was very, you could call it low level in the case of doing one entity and then verifying the result of that. But if we switch to the persistence extension, it's meant to handle the cases where you have larger data sets or more complicated data sets, and you want to externalize those from the test case. So it's a persistence test case. So now we have a couple of new annotations on the test case. It's on the test method. One that when this test method ends or is done, we're going to match that the database actually matches the conference with speaker YAML file that we have here. That is a copy of the content of our database, but excluding columns like ID or conference ID or speakers and times, which are fluent values. So the persistence extension is built upon the DBUnit tools, plus some more. It supports YAML, XML, JSON, Excel files, and a whole bunch of other formats. So it's kind of up to you how you want to do it. And if we go back to the test case, so we're saying here that when this first test method is done, it's going to look, the database is going to look the same as this file, or the content is going to be the same, and we're going to clean up the data that are in those files, in the database afterwards. And then the next method, we're saying that use this data set as the basis for this test. So insert all of this data before our test starts, and then clean up when we're done. And in that case, we're basically just getting the conference instead of inserting it. And this all runs in container. Should say green bar here soon as well. Right. So that's persistence. And if we go to the next one, which will be drone. Drone is the extension that handles everything related to Selenium and WebDriver and those types of testing tools for the client side. If we look at the drone test case, it will handle the life cycle of the Selenium driver and potentially the Selenium server in Selenium 1. And you can inject back which driver you want to use. And in the test case itself, use Selenium as as you normally would, by finding elements. In this case, we have a form on our JSF page to input a conference. You can set the different keys and just run it. So the only thing you really care about in this case is that you have, or you are focusing on your test logic and not the setup of the containers or the drivers. And the next one, which is somewhat in the same field. You go back to the slides as well. And then there's one called Arquillian warp. We've seen that you can have. Forward one. No, sorry, one slide.
What would you like?
One slide.
Back?
No, other way. There. So we've seen that the test case can either be in the container or on the client side. And what warp does is that it combines them both. So you get more of the gray box testing. So you have black box and white box being in container, and then you have the gray box with the warp extension. If you go to the test case and see what that looks like, so this is still the same we're using drone to inject the driver, and it's the same deployment. But then we are running the test case on the client side, even though this is an in-container defined deployment. We're finding the different elements in our form again, but before we're submitting it, we're wrapping that up in a warp execution. And warp stacks then up every verify step and piggybacks that on the request that is being sent to the server. So while the WebDriver is executing the submit button click, there is a server assertion object that is being piggybacked on that request and is executed within the lifecycle of that request. So when the server, if you go scroll a bit down, when the server hits, we can then annotate that server assertion up with things like before servlet or after servlet, or all the different JSF lifecycles, before render, after render, and so on, and do different assertions or create objects or whatever we want to do. So in this case, we're injecting the conference repository after the servlet is done, and verifying that it was actually stored stored in the database as well. So while our web page could potentially return the result and our Selenium test would pass, it doesn't mean that the data is actually stored in the backend. This test kind of verifies both in one. Yeah, it's a bunch to see, basically. There's Graphene. Graphene is a wrapper around the Selenium APIs to handle things like eject weight operations and weight conditions, and a lot of other, or it simplifies a lot of the standardized things around asynchronous requests in web. But in the new alpha version that is out now, it has a very interesting concept that kind of builds upon the Selenium page object, if anyone is familiar with that, where you will take instead of in your test case itself do all the fetching of the IDs or the CSS and so on, and test the actual HTML. It encapsulates that into a object where you can then say navigate to page and find me something on that page instead. Graphene pulls that up a level to a component framework type where you can have within your page, you can inject component fragments as well. If you look into the conference page object, which is a normal Selenium page object. Let's inject it on page. And then we can say within this page somewhere there is a component that has the ID of create. Then we can nest things down. And then we have created a Java API for our conference form. If you go into the form, it's basically what we had in the test case itself in the previous example. But when we have reusable components in the web layer, we can then reuse the test components as well. So one of the first things that's going to happen with this idea is that the Rich Faces project, for instance, will be providing their own their own page fragments for their JSF components. So you can then use the page objects to inject like a autocomplete form or a calendar, and then use a Java API to get the values or to set the selection, and not have to worry so much about what the actual HTML behind this is. And again, we are in the test case here, we are combining this with warp. In the test case. So the first thing we do is to navigate to a page. Then we're fetching the form from that page, and we are wrapping the form submit, which is the same as our click, within a client server side, a client server action. So the verify conference in this case is the same as the other one, where it's just verifying that it's actually stored in the database. So that's a short introduction to what Graphene, or some parts of Graphene. And then there's Byteman. Anyone know what Byteman is? JRebel's Byteman? No? Ah, awesome. It's runtime manipulation of your class files, basically. So it's mocking runtime, where you can redefine how your classes work, or how any class in the JVM work. So Arquillian integrates with Byteman by using the BM rule annotations. So here we're saying that when there's a class that is called conference repository on the store method, whatever that method does is unimportant. We're going to rewrite that to throw a new Java persistence entity exists exception. And then, well, in this case, we're just verifying that happened, but it's much more useful in let's say you have a multi-server setup and you want to force the cache to not be able to reach the other cache in a replicated scenario. You can rewrite the behavior of Java socket, for instance, and just say that there is no socket anymore. And that rule will only be active in the scope of that test. So when the test is done, the override rule is also removed. So we did this store before, it didn't fail, and now we added the expected entity exists exceptions, and it should still pass as we're rewritten the class if you have ran it. Okay? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. And there's Jakuku, there's the code coverage bit, where normally when you need code coverage on an enterprise or a container type setup, you will need to manually start the container within a different Java agent and have that agent manipulate the classes as they are pushed to the server, and you will have to find that file on the file system where that server is running. With the Arquillian integration, since we're manipulating, or we can manipulate classes on the client side, we're actually deploying the pre-instrumented classes to the container, and we're handling the result as well. So you can get code coverage on a remote server that is not on the same file system as the other one. If you run that, in this case, we're just activating a different profile in Maven to activate the Jakuku plugin that will run through our whole test suite. And should output the Jakuku coverage report. If you go up and view that in the Chrome browser, no, if you go back down and just start Chrome, do Command Tab. No, on the command line.
I'm not hearing you, sorry.
No, not that command line. The one you were at. The one command line you were at. There, and arrow up. One more. One more. There. That's a generated report from Jakuku. And if we go to the repository, the universe repository, which is our EJB, you can now see that we have coverage on the methods that were called in that scope. So we have full coverage on get and store, but we never got all of them. So that's a missing test. So the next one is JRebel integration. Anyone use JRebel for their deployments? Yeah, cool. There is an extension to delay the redeployment of the test archives within Arquillian. So the first thing we do is to activate a special Maven profile within the IDE. Which is called JRebel. I'll keep the other one as well. And that then tells Arquillian on the client side to only deploy it if we haven't deployed it before, and then it would generate out the XML or the JRebel XML to point to the local disk, and from there on let JRebel handle the updating of the deployment as we change it. If you go down to the standard warp test case that we had before, and if you run that once and we look at what's being deployed to the server, are you scrolling or?
I don't know.
Go down.
I can't see.
Go to the bottom? Go to the bottom of the... Did you run the test or?
I thought I had.
Okay, demo gods are in. Awesome. Well, anyway, the point there is that when the first time you run it and it's not been deployed, Arquillian will deploy it. Normally, the second time you run the same test case, Arquillian stops the deployment because it's already existing, because it never undeployed it, and then it's just JRebel's class loading that is updating your EGBs or your test case on the client side as you keep writing them. So is that the only thing that exists in the Arquillian universe? And not at all. There's extensions for doing Android-based testing, for iOS testing, visualized testing with RushEye to verify that the output of a application, being the image or the visual aspects of it, actually looks correct, and not just that it has the correct HTML, but the CSS and all that matches up. Spring to handle Spring MVC and to handle Spring embedded containers. There's a tiny performance extension to measure the aggregating performance of different test methods. Next one. There's a transaction extension to handle rolling back a transaction or starting one before and after the test methods. JSF Unit 2, Seam 2, and Portal integrations. And if you want to know more about, go on. And there's also support for Arquillian in Maven, where Arquillian only handles the containers, so you can use a Maven plugin similar to Jetty Run or the cargo containers, where you will start up a container as part of the Maven lifecycle and not necessarily a part of the test lifecycle, and also deploy and undeploy from them. There's a Forge plugin to handle simplifying the setup of dependencies and create test cases and versions and so on. And there's more talks at Java 1 this year that goes more in depth on the different topics. Lincoln and Brian has one about JSF. We'll cover more of drone, warp, and Graphene. Carl has one. We'll go into mobile testing with Android. And Marius has one for the Spring parts of it, where it's using the Spring extension to test.
We have another one.
And we have another one. Oh, that's true. On
Wednesday.
Wednesday.
Sure.
On Wednesday?
On Wednesday, we'll be going through use cases in Java EE testing. So we're going to be looking at a bunch of the rougher edges along Java EE testing, transaction, security, nodes. We're going to pull from our examples and do probably some user questions and probably have a discussion about how we can use Arquillian to dig into the container and do some white box stuff in addition to the black box stuff, and integrate this all together from a use case-based perspective. So that'll be on Wednesday afternoon.
Yeah, you can find us on Google+, and we're at arquillian.org, and we're, of course, open source, and we're all on GitHub, all the extensions and core. Anyone have any questions, or is everything clear on this little talk? Excuse me? Yes, not currently, I think, but it's part of the training material that's being created now, I think. Wait. Yeah, he should know.
Although we are writing a book.
Huh?
I said, although we are writing a book.
Yeah.
Which will showcase the usage of Arquillian and various jboss.org technologies that are complementary to Java EE and building on top of it, and even going into things like JRebel and whatnot. The book is called Continuous Enterprise Development in Java, and it's available for the early access release is out now. We have some cards that we can show you, and you can go in and kind of take a peek at the types of things that we're going to be addressing in that book, which will cover the things that Aslak showed you today, and also the use cases that will be shown on Wednesday. But yeah, the Arquillian suite is pretty consistent throughout. I mean, it's used as the test suite for EAP, which is the Enterprise Application Platform. So as these things roll out and the training comes in, I imagine that the Arquillian training will have a central role in that part too as well. Sure. We have some handouts for you. It is called Continuous Enterprise Development in Java, and it's available. We have a book site that's being built at continuousdev.org. So if you come up here, you can grab a little thing. There's a QR code, and you can take a look at that at your leisure.
There's also a book number 2 in the works from Pact. I'm not sure what the name of that will be yet, but there's more than one in the works currently. Nothing? Oh, thank you for me.
Class dismissed early.